Hello, I'm Stuart Goldsmith, and this is another clip from my Comedian's Comedian podcast in which I spoke to Stewart Lee, who is one of the most thrillingly funny, iconoclastic and original comedians that Britain, indeed probably the world, has to offer. We talked back in 2017 about the joys of being a working comedian and the very specific and delicate relationship that he enjoys navigating with his audience. Here's Stewart Lee.
I do about 3 months on the circuit, if you know what I mean, from about April to sort of June, and I'll try and do 5-6 nights a week. And then I do get to see lots of new acts then. But there are so many. I mean, when I started doing it in 1989, there was only about 80 people doing this nationally. So you knew everyone pretty quickly, and you could kind of keep pace with its development. But the last 10 years or so, it's exploded. And also, I'm a bit disconnected from it. So I really like that 3 months being on the circuit, trying to see people I've not seen before, and try and sort of work out where it's at and what direction it's going in. But Mac's really good, because something about, how it's booked and the sort of festival it's become means that lots of the people on there are the sorts of people that I would be interested in anyway. Yeah. You know, so there's been a sort of filter put on it. So I do like that.
Yeah, the filter of Henry Whittaker.
Well, the filter
very
of Henry
specifically
Whittaker,
only allowing people he thinks are great or interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean...
Or nice,
even if I don't get to see people's acts, if I see their face, I sort of think, oh, that's one of the ones to watch. Because they're at... So, yeah, you get a sort of sense there of... I mean, weirdly, that McCuntleth actually feels like the comedy tent at Glastonbury in the 80s. You know, it feels like an 80s alternative. It feels like when festivals were part of what we called the counterculture, you know, the kind of comedians that are on at McCuntleth and the way it works, that there's a bar with a band playing in it and people are camping, and that's like being in the comedy tent at festivals nearly 30 years ago before they got all owned by Festival Republic, and you know what I mean? So it sort of feels... And I love the fact they can go with the kids, because when I was a teenager, I used to go off to those crusty festivals on my own and often I saw a lot of... One of the first places I saw the alternative comedy was at the Elephant Fair in Cornwall in 1984, which I think was Jenny Eclair and Malcolm and Hardy and Mark Steele and the Popticians and Hegley, and in a tent like the one, like a McCuntleth sort of vibe, you know. So, and I like going with the kids, because obviously... They're growing up in middle-class London and in a sterile, urban sort of environment, and it's nice for them to have a taste. Henry's created a kind of virtual model of kind of a weird 80s festival. You know, so it's sort of like, I find it nostalgic. You know, there's like local people selling cider and, you know, curry vans and stuff. It doesn't feel like... a lot of them do now. So, yeah, I really like it. But that weekend, I mean, this show was a weird one to get together, because, first of all... Okay, each block of work that I do, I have to sort of think, who's the character now, right? What is his status and what's his relationship to the rest of the world? And lots of people have to think about why they're on stage and who they are. And with me, I've sort of decided he's on stage because he's a comedian. Right?
Yeah,
and he
that's explicitly his job, isn't it?
Yeah, it's explicitly his job, and he has to try and do that job. And in each show, he's trying to do that job for some reason, either out of sort of bitterness to prove himself better than other people, or to meet basic financial needs that he's saddled himself with. But in each show, he's prevented from doing it by some problem, either of his own making or some external one. So there's some sort of jeopardy. And so at the start of each one, I have to sort of think about how I relate to things. And the process of working with the BBC on Comedy Vehicle for 10 years has made that difficult but also interesting. For example, in between the first and second series, it took a long time to get whichever show that was. In between the first and second series and the second and third series, I think I did the tours that were Carpet Remnant World and If You Prefer a Milder Comedian, and they both took a few months to settle, because I didn't know where I was at the time, because the BBC didn't know whether they were commissioning or not commissioning a second and third series. So it was all kind of in limbo. So on the one hand, I didn't know what my status was. You know, I didn't know whether I was this person with a secure TV job.
Or had you been rejected.
Or had you been rejected,
which would have made it easier.
Yeah, it would have made it easier. Yeah, and actually, partly why this one's much more lively than the last few, and he's a lot more sort of boisterous and bolshy on stage, because it's been cancelled, right? That sort of gives him he's allowed to be cocky because it comes from a lower status position, you know. So, and anyway, what had happened with this is, again, in May, I didn't know what was going on because it had been cancelled, which I didn't really mind, to be honest. But there were these sort of attempts to refloat it through some other. There were lots of people there that liked it, who wanted to try and do it through some other department, or, you know. So it was all kind of, I didn't really know, and they couldn't really tell me whether, if they were going to do it again, whether I would end up dismantling this tour into parts of a series, which obviously means you have to write it with a really different rhythm because you're looking for 60-minute or 30-minute blocks or something. So that was all weird. And then it kindly finally went away. Actually, in the end, I had to sort of decide that just to get on with it, whatever they were deciding. And then June, I mean, I've made a joke out of it in the show, but in June, when the Brexit happened, I mean, I didn't do what Bridget did, which is Bridget Christie, my wife, which is she threw away her show and started again. But I thought, well, it does change everything because it's the beginning of the dismantling of post-war liberal democracy. And that's sort of the framework I've grown up aspiring to and understanding. And so I felt I had to sort of address it, which meant I had to create these sort of spaces in the show where I could do little bits about politics. And also I knew I wanted to keep it on the road till April next year because I see this as also a sort of chance to make some money out of it because I'm not selling it to the BBC.
Yes, you don't have another. I mean, for a while,
weirdly, you make more live on the material than by giving it to the telly. And at 48, 2 kids, not in particularly good shape. You know, you sort of think, well, this will be a debt clearing one. You know, so I had to write something that would work for a long time. So there were all sorts of sort of structural problems created by the need to keep it on the road for 18 months, the uncertainty and the politics being so volatile.
You arguably have the best model, or certainly when the TV show was running, when there were more series in the pipeline, you had the best model, I guess, for how to be a working comedian in Britain.
Really?
Right. Well, in terms of you gig every night to a theatre that is near your house, in Leicester Square.
4 months of the year.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah. But for those 4 months, that's like your kind of putting the show together time is like, if you look at what I'm trying to do at the moment, I'm doing a tour where I do an hour, which is last year's show, and in the second half I do new stuff, and it's very informal and stuff like that. So I'm like, I've managed to find a way to preview new stuff to get it in.
Yeah.
You were doing like this incredible version of that where you were, looking at it, I don't mean cynically at all, but you were getting rehearsal time that was paid, and you didn't need to travel for it. It was like the pre-tour section, and then you were selling the results to TV.
Yeah, in the end, I mean, I do think there's no way around it that you get that stage time makes you better, and also, What I'll do in that 3 or 4 months at Leicester Square is play the material all sorts of different ways. Like I think the night that you came in was pretty I was being pretty hard with them and truculent. Other nights I'll try it with levity. I'll do sort of different things. And also if something goes wrong in the room during that 3-month period, I'll just run it into the ground and see what happens, because sometimes a really good thing will come out of that. And it's amazing how much it changes through sort of forced improvisation. If you go back at the end of the 3 months and look at what you wrote, you realise you're not really doing it anymore. The story might be the same, but the whole nuanced intonation of it has changed. The other reason for doing that is I've got a very sort of workmanlike attitude to thinking ahead, right? And I sort of feel like at the moment, while I'm still fit enough to do it, I feel I'm trying to consolidate an audience for the future. And I think that an audience has a much better time at the Leicester Square Theatre in a 450-seater room than they do at the O2. Also, I can break down the audience into little bits and play off different people's reactions, which is much harder to do in a massive room. And also, at Leicester Square Theatre, you can do a longer show in a better room and charge half what you are obliged to at the O2 or Hammersmith, right? And also, all those people will come back. 90% of them will come back and bring a friend because they've had a really great experience. Yeah, whereas I do think the larger shows start to get quite passively consumed. And I've seen really good people at Hammersmith and a lot of people wandering around and talking. There's just something about the diffuse nature of it, right? So it's partly a thing about trying to to play to as many people as possible in as small a space as possible, as is viable, right? So that if I do get to the point where I can only do 50 shows a year because I'm so old, and then when I do those 50 and 10,000 seater places, hopefully the people will come with you. You know, it's sort of sustainable from them. But and I like being able to charge less, and also it's not altruistic because there aren't the same overheads. I do no advertising, you know, so I see as much of the £25 or £20 as somebody does as 60 for somewhere else, but you haven't got the costs, you know. Yeah. You haven't got to hire in a massive crew and whatever. So actually it's nice to be able to charge less because I've got this sort of stupid thing being of that sort of 80s post-punk indie generation where I sort of think people ought to be able to afford to go to things. And one of the problems I have when I periodically get involved because of my history with theatre to do commercially West End theatre things, and the talks inevitably break down at the point where it's clear that half the actors are going to be on terrible money and the tickets are going to be 90 quid and no one's going to be able to do anything about touts. So it's just like it's not worth it to me. You know?
Is there a tension between you wanting to consolidate and retain and expand the audience of, say, the live shows at Leicester Square, and you wanting to be able to take risks and risk pissing them off?
Yeah, there is. And actually, I wonder if it's reached its elastic limit, because I did 4 nights in Brighton on this tour at the Dome, which is about, I think it's about 8 or 9,000 people, you know, but one night, the Saturday night, there was just enough people in looking at their phones for me to wish I'd done one night less and they hadn't bought tickets, right? Because it just starts to feel like any show then where passive consumers have come in. And but, you know, what I do is I do lots of sort of charactery stuff in the first 20 minutes where he arrogantly says this is happening on his terms, it's not for the benefit of the public, and if they don't like it, they should have gone to something else. And the whole persona is about, it's kind of take it or leave it to the audience. It's not really for them. Yeah. So it would you feel like it would happen anyway, whether they were there or not. And so, which of course the opposite is true. Obviously I'm working really hard to make the night work, but because he can give off a level of indifference, I still think you can then sort of experiment. Although I think maybe the material that I toured for the 4th show was the most weird stuff that I've done to a mass audience, and it works 9 times out of 10 on tour. But when we came to film it, the numbers game was much lower. Like if you're doing something really odd to 1,000 people, if 10% of them like it, that's 100, and you can build from that 100 and eventually get the 1,000. Okay. But if you're doing something really odd to 100 people in a small room, which is how we filmed the telly show, and to 10% of them like it, that's 10 people. And as you know from doing different sizes of rooms, the tipping point for 10 is going to be much lower, harder to shift that 10 into 100.
And you were, and with Series 4, you were, by that point, you were kind of entrenched in this system that you had, which I think is an incredibly laudable, brave, interesting, exciting way to do a TV show. Right. Here we go. This is the show. You film each episode once?
Twice. Yeah. Okay. You sometimes end up cutting between them, but I
take back one of my adjectives. I didn't realise you did that.
You do it twice, but you normally end up not on the same night. You don't do it twice to the same audience. You normally end up using one of them.
That would be a real experiment for next time.
Yeah, but really that's more about just sort of, sometimes I don't get coverage of stuff, you know. And also, different things will happen every night. Again, I try to force real events to happen. Although the weird thing about that is people don't believe it, because telly's normally so controlled. Mm-hmm. Every single thing that's made it to the screen in Comedy Vehicle, that was a real thing that happened in the room, like someone dropping something or getting up or something failing and me changing it around. You look online and there'll be these long discussions about, oh yeah, the guy that shouted that out, he's an actor, I know who he is, I've seen him. And it's like they think it's all, you see things on about live shows where something will happen on the night and you'll sort of deal with it, and it might take 20 minutes or whatever, and then they all say, oh, it's an actor, he takes with him every night. And the logistics of it would be... I think my father, actually, I took my dad... My dad didn't really see a lot of comedy, but I took him to see Al Murray about 20 years ago, and you know Al's like the king of... He'll have like 40 people in the room, and he's learned all their names, and the whole first hour's just playing them off against each other. I mean, he's got a card index in his brain of sort of jokes about jobs almost. That, you know, and we saw him at a big theatre in London, and afterwards my dad went, "Oh, it's amazing how he had all those actors in, and he remembered who was sitting where." And I went, "What?" And he went, "Yeah, all those people that are, you know, he knows where they're..." I realised that he thought. Now, my dad was a rep for a packaging company. He worked in business, and yet he'd not thought it through that the logistical difficulty of taking 36 people on the road who would be on equity minimum all week just to shout out, "I work in crisps" or something. it would cost like a sort of Phantom of the Opera sized cast for a stand-up show. So people, funny audiences, sometimes if you handle something with aplomb, they assume that it's been faked. Or weirdly with me, if I destroy something on purpose so that I completely lose my thread, because I'm trying to put myself into a corner to see what happens, they assume you actually can't really do stand-up.
It's always nice to perform in a venue that looks and feels like a really oversubscribed one of those puzzle room escape games.